take us back to that Father's Day in 2023. So a couple of years ago, and the murder and killing that happened. Who was he? What happened to him? Walk it out, and why this became such a big story, and certainly something that got officials in Canada, the U.S., and elsewhere alarmed.
Well, many viewers may remember this extraordinary series of events that actually began later in the year, in September 2023, when the then Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, accused agents of the Indian government of being involved in the killing of a Canadian citizen, this Sikh separatist, Hardeep Singh Nijjar. And that was a big story, a big law enforcement story, a big geopolitical story. What I've done with this documentary and with the accompanying story in Bloomberg Businessweek is go behind the scenes not only of that story, but also of something that was unfolding in parallel, a really amazing tale happening in New York City, in Washington, involving the alleged targeting for murder of an American Sikh activist, Gurpatwant Singh Panun. And that affair, that series of events and those allegations ended up at the absolute highest levels of the Biden administration, of the White House, the State Department, National Security Council, and becoming a very significant issue in relations between the U.S. and India, which of course are crucial to everything going on in the Indo-Pacific and in the global economy then and now.
Matthew, we're going to get to some of those issues in just a few minutes. But before we do that, I want to go back in time and just get an understanding from you about the history here. The Khalistan movement, the Sikh separatists and the Sikh activists who've lived outside of India. Just give us some background there as to what led to this moment in 2023.
Well, this goes back a long way, actually, to before I was born, to the early 1980s, when there was a lot of agitation for greater autonomy for Sikhs within India. Some of that ultimately led to violence. There was a very bloody clash between Sikh nationalists and the Indian military in 1984 in the city of Amritsar. Subsequent to that, the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, was assassinated by two of her Sikh bodyguards. And so there has been a lot of violence on both sides of this, going back a long way. Sikh nationalism is something that has never really died out, but it has ebbed and flowed. And one of the interesting things about this story is that the so-called Khalistan movement, which is this campaign for the creation of an independent Sikh nation, is rooted overwhelmingly these days in diaspora communities. There is not really an organized Khalistan campaign within India itself. However, there is a lot of organizing for this cause in the US, in Canada, in the UK, Australia, other Sikh communities around the world. And that organizing has become a significant, some would say disproportionate, but certainly significant focus of attention from Indian law enforcement and the Indian government more generally.
Yeah, why has the Khalistani movement, why has it become much more prominent overseas and less visible in like Punjab in India? Why is that?
Well, I don't think it's totally unprecedented. I mean, there were certainly, there are probably supporters of the Irish Republican Army who hung on longer in Boston than they did in Ireland itself. The idea of diaspora communities being in some ways more strident, more radical than the people who actually live somewhere is not totally unfamiliar to us. But I think there are a few reasons. One is it's just legally very hard to do this kind of advocacy in India. There are a lot of ways that the government, which does consider advocacy for Khalistan to be sedition in some cases and has accused the leaders of the movement of terrorism, there are a lot of ways for the government to stop you. Another thing that I think is important is that Sikhs in India are well integrated. I mean, there was a Sikh prime minister for a 10-year period before Narendra Modi took office in 2014. Sikhs are a very successful minority within the sort of Indian mosaic. So there's kind of a quixotic quality to this. It is this small band of activists overseas pursuing something that I think it's fair to say is very unlikely, extremely unlikely, ever to become a reality. But nonetheless, the Indian government takes this very seriously and has made it clear that it views this kind of advocacy and this kind of campaign as something it does not want going on.
Well, that's where I want to go, Matt, because, there's a spectrum of those seeking political changes or representation in any community, any state, any country. There's healthy political differences, there's political activism, and then there's terrorism, right? So there's a spectrum. So, where does this lie? Is this just people looking for representation, or are there, out and about terrorists, which any country, any government, including the United States, will take military action against terrorists? And some would maybe say that India has every right, if they are deemed, threats to India, to take action against.
Well, Carol, it really depends who you talk to. The position of the Indian government, of Indian police, has been consistently over the years that the individual leaders of the Khalistan movement are involved in violence, incitement, the actual organization of terrorist acts in some cases. Those allegations are out there constantly in the Indian press. They have been forwarded by Indian law enforcement to their counterparts in the US, in Canada, in the UK. And there have been a number of extradition requests for these Khalistan activists living abroad. However, when Western governments have received this information, received these extradition requests, according to my reporting and people familiar with the matter who I've spoken to, they've looked into them and concluded that there was no basis to act. There's a very high evidentiary bar to bring in criminal charges, obviously, in the US or in Canada or the UK. There's an even higher bar for both substantive and procedural reasons to extradition. And the answer, again and again, from law enforcement in these Western countries has been, we don't see anything illegal here, and we don't see anything that wouldn't, for example, in the US, be protected by the First Amendment. So there's been a kind of mutual incomprehension where India says repeatedly, these individuals are terrorists, and then their Western counterparts say, well, we just can't find any evidence of that.
You did spend months talking with sources, Matt, going through legal filings and documents for this story to report it out. What were some of the biggest revelations for you?
One of the elements of this story that I was really surprised by was that this case in New York City, the alleged targeting of this Sikh activist who lives in Queens, became an absolutely central focus for the White House over a period of quite a few months, actually more like a year, in 2023 and 2024. This was at the top levels of the Biden administration, a major preoccupation. And when you think about it, that actually makes sense. For officials like Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, India was the whole ballgame. There was a long-term plan to make India the cornerstone of a kind of containment strategy for China. And maintaining a really strong relationship with India was seen as crucial. And yet you had, allegedly, agents affiliated with the Indian government targeting an American citizen in New York City for allegedly a murder. So you can imagine how that became extremely complicated and resulted in some pretty tough debates between the law enforcement and political and foreign policy sides of the administration.
Well, let's fast forward a little bit to the criminal cases that are happening right now in the US and Canada. What is the status of those cases?
So we have two trials coming up, although at the moment neither of them has a firm date. In New York City, we have the trial of an Indian man named Nikhil Gupta, who allegedly was one of the organizers of this murder-for-hire plot against Gurpatwant Singh Panun. He was arrested in the Czech Republic in 2023 and extradited to the US. So he will go on trial at some point fairly soon on murder-for-hire charges in federal court in Manhattan. There is also another defendant from India who has not been arrested, Vikash Yadav, allegedly an operative of India's main foreign intelligence agency. He remains at large. In Canada, there have been 4 arrests. 4 individuals, all Indian men in their 20s, were charged with the murder of this activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar. They are currently in pretrial proceedings in Vancouver. They will go on trial at some point, probably late next year.
You know, I do wonder, too, as you just said, how tricky this was for the Biden administration, right? And especially, you know, I think about the trade war and people thinking, you know, the strained relationship between the United States and China, Matt, and then looking to shift to India. And that's certainly more of something we've talked about in this most recent year. I mean, India is seen as this incredibly rising superpower. What does this incident possibly say about where this country stands in the world and among global leaders, other global leaders?
I think whatever the rights and wrongs and the different allegations and denials about these specific events, I think it is fair to say that we are dealing with a much more assertive India than has been the case in the past, a country that will advocate very forthrightly for what it sees as its interests and act upon those interests when it feels necessary to do so. You know, India, despite being enormously populous, for most of the post-war period was not at the top table of global geopolitics. For example, it's not a permanent member of the Security Council. It does not have military alliances in formal ways for the most part. That has changed, obviously. India, in addition to being the most populous country in the world, is a huge and growing economy. Every Western country is looking for investment from India. They have a lot to offer. They know they have a lot to offer. And in return, they are going to want to make sure that their interests are reflected in geopolitics.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And you've got to think the whole world is watching. And what is the message to the world if India is indeed responsible but not held accountable, as it would be with any nation? Matt, great reporting, and so glad we could get some time with you, and also highly recommend everyone check out the documentary. I think it's about 20 minutes or so, and it's on the Bloomberg Terminal, a Bloomberg Originals documentary series. And of course, Matthew Campbell, Asia editor at Bloomberg Businessweek, joining us from our Sydney bureau. But again, his reporting, it was a Bloomberg Big Take. It's on the Terminal and also can be found at Bloomberg.com, along with the documentary series.
Yeah, the Bloomberg Originals documentary series, bloomberg.com/originals. Should note, too, India's Ministry of External Affairs didn't respond to requests for comment. India has rejected claims it was involved in the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada and promised an investigation into the New York case involving Gurpawant Singh Panum, suggesting rogue operatives might have been responsible.